I'd like to welcome our readers and our viewing audience to the second interview of our Talking with the Author series. This series is sponsored by the Journal of Educational Controversy here at the Western Washington University. And we feature authors whose works have been published in our journal. Our guest today is Dr. David Engle, whose article entitled While Our Students Watched was published in our winter 2006 issue. That was an issue that was dedicated to the life and work of Jonathan Kozol. In the article that Jonathan Kozol wrote, he talks about the then pending United States Supreme Court decision. It's called Parents Involved in Community Schools versus the Seattle School District Number 1. And I think we'll just refer to this as Picks versus Seattle during our session today. The case was to decide the question of whether race could be used as a factor in assigning students to public schools. Because of the importance of this case, the Journal of Educational Controversy ran a special section in that issue that was entitled Washington State Politics and the Supreme Court Decision. And we invited David Engle to tell his story as the principal of the high school that was at the center of this controversy. The action that David took as principal of Ballard High School in Seattle led Jonathan Kozol to describe David in his article as, quote, an unusually courageous man, end quote. So I'm very pleased to have David Engle here today to discuss these issues with us, and I'd like to welcome you, David, to our program.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you for the very generous introduction.
David, I thought we might begin by looking at the larger context and framework in which you wrote your article. Perhaps we could start by asking you to talk about what was at stake with this case and what led up to the decisions that you made and the actions that you took.
Where to start? Well, I think for me, the situation at Ballard and in most urban school districts that I was kind of a participant in was responding to what I saw in terms of our educational system, of how privilege is lived in our society and what part it plays in distributing educational resources to students. And so I saw it in a pretty large context initially, and then it narrowed quickly to my particular setting, to my school, to my students, and involved kind of an evolution, I think, for me in terms of how to act directly to what I call shaping a conversation about race and about the issues of integration and a discussion for me about the value of integration in our society and its future. And so for me, it quickly was, there were large issues that became very personal and direct and localized, but they remain large issues, and they play out in school after school and district after district across the country in new ways now. And it's very clear to me now that that we have redefined what legal segregation looks like in the United States, and folks are starting to think and talk about how that's working and how that's playing out in the lives of our young people. So I think for me, it's brought me kind of full circle to my youth when I was brought up with the notion that an integrated society was the one commonwealth as Americans we could look to as kind of our best future. And now being nearly 60 years old, looking at a society who no longer agrees around that commitment and has now found ways to legalize segregation and separation in ways that I think make me very uncomfortable and kind of forced my hand as a professional to act as I did at Ballard.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the, perhaps just for our audience if you could talk about what your school was engaged in that brought you to the attention of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Okay. Well, I was fortunate to inherit a brand new high school in Seattle, one of the first new buildings in the city in many years. And so not only did we institute some great programs there, academic programs for kids, but we had an attractive facility. And we were in a part of Seattle that was just starting to kind of revive itself and as a renaissance on in Ballard. So it became a very attractive educational resource for not only kind of the immediate Ballard community, which had until that time, until the opening of the new building, not been on the academic map of Seattle at all, and was not an attractive school. In fact, it had enrollment issues prior to the remodeling. But it became a very attractive educational setting for kids, and I'm proud of the work my staff did to make sure that happened. But the issue was that it became attractive to people that typically had not chosen to come there, people that live in a fairly privileged part of Seattle. And when it was announced that Seattle would institute a diversity plan, an integration plan that did not involve mandatory busing, but would involve a choice program for students and families to choose different high schools in the city, they created a formula that allowed for schools to use a racial tiebreaker to create more of a diverse student population. If you know anything about Seattle, you know that north of the Ship Canal in Seattle, the Ship Canal being the freshwater exit to the Puget Sound, those schools typically were primarily white students and represented that part of the demographic of Seattle. And students south of the Ship Canal typically were demographically very different, more students of color and higher poverty rates. And those schools were less well-resourced, with a few exceptions. So the notion that students could choose to come from somewhere else in Seattle, south of the Ship Canal, and go to a school in the north end where the resources were, like I said, more attractive, was how we attracted greater diversity at Ballard at that time. Where we had a conflict, of course, was when a group of parents from Magnolia, which had been a community that's kind of in a between neighborhood area, chose to come to Ballard and found out that they weren't at the top of the list in terms of the wait list that I had to move in as I enrolled students in my building. I chose to use the racial tiebreaker pretty enthusiastically, I should put it, because I felt from my student body's perspective that that would be a good thing for the majority of the students who were predominantly white, middle-class kids from the North End, and that this would be a good thing to benefit their educational experience. I also felt that the students that did come in from other parts of Seattle had benefit as well because they had access to programs that weren't available in the other schools in Seattle, such as the Biotechnology Academy. So there was a mutual benefit there, I felt. So when I came to this school, I let the parents know that I would not move their students into the school population because I was going to apply pretty aggressively the tiebreaker. And that's where the challenge came from in terms of the legal issues.
Could you talk a little bit about the stance that you took in order to, I think you said in your article, to break the silence about this issue across the country? You felt that it was important to, for the sake of your students, for the sake of the public debate, for somebody to come out and take a stance. What did you actually do, David?
Okay. Well, when I came to Seattle, I had kind of a long history of moving from rural to suburban to metropolitan to urban school districts, and my commitment had always been to combine my interest in justice and my spiritual values in a setting where I could kind of realize in a holistic way those commitments in an educational format. And for me, in Seattle, there are terrible gaps between students in terms of achievement academically, in terms of access to quality programs, and I felt like this for me will be a chance in this school to create a vision for the future that I think could apply across the city and across the country in terms of providing equitable opportunities for all students. And I'm kind of old-fashioned about that. By equity, I mean as a parent, you know that some children require more energy and effort and resources than other children, but that you love them equally and hope to have them in a place where they're viable at the end of your parenting. And so I approached my work in Seattle with that spirit. Because I met with the parents of the students that wanted into the school from the Magnolia almost my first week on the job, I knew I was in for legal challenges. And I started thinking through kind of what the ramifications of my aggressive stance towards creating diversity in my school. And I had some inkling that this issue could go before the courts and would be adjudicated, but I had no real sense of what that would look like in terms of my professional life and how I live my professional life. I think, fortunately, I probably was fortunate in being naive around that, because I don't know if I would have signed up for the effort had I known what would transpire. In 2002, when the court, in April, when we had the first court decision that upended the Seattle's use of the tiebreaker, it was again by the Ninth Circuit made that decision with a 3-judge decision. And I felt like I've met a lot of judges in my life. I know people in the legal profession. My son's an attorney. I know they're human. I know they interpret the laws according to their lights. I think they're wrong, and I want to somehow push back on this. And at the time, I didn't have money or influence or the kinds of things that I guess support challenges in the courts from my perspective. But I did have the position of an urban principal, and I was at a time in my life where I felt like I can push back a little and use my position in a way. And I'm in a city where the schools are very visible, and if I can capture the media's attention long enough, I think this issue will become a community-wide conversation, given the kind of careful response that I had to learn how to do kind of on the job. And so when I made the decision a week after that court decision, I met with my family and I met with lots of people that are important to me and said, I think this is where I'm going to go with this. And I got different advice about how to proceed, from don't do it, you're crazy, to, well, if you are going to do it, here's what you need to remember. And I made the decision. The night before the decision, I met with the superintendent at the time, Joseph Olszewski, and I said, Joseph, and this was just after a meeting with my Latino community at Ballard, where we talked about equity issues, and they loudly remonstrated about the court decision at that meeting. And I thought, okay, that's what I needed to hear. Let him know about it, and he was concerned but supportive. And so the next day I made the announcement, and I was very careful to kind of get to my students and staff first, because I didn't want to put our school into the middle of this without letting them know first. So I met with my staff early that morning, and then I met with the students early that morning, so that the school community were the first to know about this. And then as it played out, the court reconsidered their decision and reconvened en banc and made a different decision. The court case proceeded from there because the Pix folks had deep pockets and a lot of support to take the case forward, and the rest is kind of history. It went to the Supreme Court. But in terms of my acting, the conversation in Seattle, I think, really opened up. I know that just from the invitations I had to every service club in Seattle, to municipal organizations, to union halls, churches. I was thoroughly, I went from being a pretty behind-the-scenes sort of principal to thoroughly public person in a few months. And the conversation continued on deep into the community in ways I had never anticipated. So I think in terms of the silence about race, what I found in those conversations was that folks wanted to talk about race in a real honest, open way, but they didn't know and how to, and they didn't know how to convene those meetings, and they didn't know how to facilitate them. And it was fortunate, and the role I could play was kind of catalyzing those conversations in a way that felt safe to people. And what I mean by that is sometimes I was the target, you know, and they could say things to me directly that carried a message of, here's what I really think about integration, here's what I really think about separate but equal, here's what I think about you as, you know, a public person, or here's what I think about the schools, and they could target me. And I had been counseled long and hard to be a good listener, to be patient, to not rush to judgment or reaction, and believe me, that's an acquired skill of mine. And over time, I was able to, I think, facilitate some really painful but necessary conversations in the community. And that conversation goes on to this day, so that now when I read board minutes in Seattle, I see references made to concerns people have about the resegregation of schools in Seattle that reflect those conversations we had that spring and summer. So I know it was valuable. It did make things trickier for folks because of everybody's positioning around race, but I think that's the story of the topic in our society, and we're in a messy place right now. I think we're in a place that, like I said, has come full circle now, where the Supreme Court has found a way to reify legal separation and segregation of our schools, and now it's up to the schools and people of commitment and faith in justice to figure out how we're going to move forward from this position we're at. So.
I have my students read your article in my classes, and they are preparing to become teachers, and I think they struggle the way we all struggle about when should one take a stance in life, and what are the consequences of those stances. I think our students would be really interested in knowing what happened the day after you resigned your position to protest the court decision. You loved the school, you loved the neighborhood, you were living in the neighborhood, and suddenly the next day you're out of a job. There's uncertainty about where David Engle is going to be at this point. Nick, could you share with us personally what that feels like after the day after you took your major decision?
Great. Yeah. Well, I think the metaphor that's always worked for me after I made the decision, and actually that feeling started almost immediately when I thought I'm sure about what I'm going to do, was what I would say is free falling. And I grew up in a family where my father is a world-class mountain climber, and so I spent a lot of time climbing, and there were times when I fell and I was roped. Fortunately, I was roped, and my father helped rescue me from that. But I know the feeling of free falling, and that's what I could liken that to. What I knew about that was that there are always surprises in making those kinds of decisions. I don't see life as an on-off, zero-sum game. I think sometimes you have to be always open to the surprises that come after you take an action like that. So for me, it was not a negative free fall. It was just, okay, here I go. I'm falling, and I'm going to keep my eyes open and experience this and know what to do next. So I had a lot of faith that there would be a next thing to do. But for a while there, it was pretty disconcerting. It really focused my work, though. In the last several months at Ballard High School, I met with my students. I listened to them a lot, got their feedback. And what was most positive for me, my staff kind of broke out in terms of their perspective on my stand based on preconceptions about me or the relationships we had. But what was interesting for me, for my students, and there weren't a lot of surprises there, with the students was even the kids that felt like they disagreed with me completely felt comfortable enough to come to me and talk about that. And for me, the value of the whole project was to open the conversation. It wasn't to settle it or decide it or end it. It was to open it. And to have kids come to me and say, be able to say, I'm completely in opposition to what you did, I think you were wrong, and describe why and to give their reasons, for me, I took a lot of joy from that, because I felt like there's a lot of authority and power in play in these situations, and I think for kids to feel comfortable enough to kind of address the issues that are really important there and not pay any mind to kind of the other peripheral issues around power and authority was very heartening to me. And then I had a lot of students who had been silent on the issue come forward and talk to me about what it meant for them and their families. I had parents from the community show up and interact with me in ways that is not typical of a principal-parent exchange. So I felt like it was really a gift in a lot of ways that I needed. And then, as I said at the time to my staff, it was the beginning of me coming into adulthood in a lot of ways, because I had lived, kind of in the shelter of privilege and expectations around privilege, and to kind of step outside of those boundaries and then experience life from a different perspective was part of my maturation too. And I always believe that it's never too late to grow up. So I valued that experience, even the more negative interactions that I had. I'm a learner, and I always learn something positive from those. So when people attacked me or responded pretty negatively to me, I learned from that. What is the message here? What is it that I've done that contributed to this? Or what can I learn from this? How do I change to not live in that kind of ideation much longer? So I learned a lot from that. But the free-falling part was my initial reaction, and I had enough life experience to know that I'm going to land safely somehow, and felt confident in that just because I felt like this is, in the end, this is a democratic society. This is a society that does place some value in opposition and to political theater, and will permit me to recreate myself, and that's been proven correct.
I know that you talked in your article about the value of an integrated classroom, a diverse classroom. In our issue, we also ran an opposing view. The article by Bruce Bivens, who was at the time the vice principal at Franklin High School. I think he's a principal somewhere now in Seattle. I'm not sure which. West Seattle, is it? Principal of West Seattle now. Thank you. Bruce, in his article, talked about the importance of the neighborhood school and the importance it had in promoting a sense of community, of getting parents more involved. I was wondering, how would you respond to the concerns that Bruce was raising in his article?
Thank you for bringing up Bruce. I actually saw Bruce several months ago. Bruce and I are good friends, and we disagree about this issue, I think, fairly substantially. But here's how I would respond to that. What Bruce is arguing for is adequately funded neighborhood schools. And philosophically, I agree with that. I think that's a wonderful vision. However, 100 years of history should tell us that what that's a formula for is separate but unequal. Because in fact, in an argument I will make, the reason I think diverse student populations are important, it has more in some ways to do with how privilege plays in society than it does around the issue of equity, and I'll explain that in a second. But Bruce is arguing for equitably funded neighborhood schools, and I don't have any argument with that. However, I'm more of a pragmatist in that I know that typically has played out in negative ways for kids in terms of the notion of separate but unequal. Here's what I mean by that. What I have seen in urban districts is where the middle class is most embedded, those schools prosper, and those schools have more resources available for their students. They have more advocacy operating within the school district, and they tend to position themselves better in terms of what happens for kids. I've seen that's replete across the country, where you have schools where you have a PTSA that can raise considerable amounts of money to support academic programs. You have better programs and you have more demand for those programs. What happens in neighborhood schools, especially in Seattle, where housing redlining was the reality for many years, is you have neighborhoods that are racially and ethnically separate and where they're poorly integrated. And so the schools reflect those inequities. And for anybody to pretend that, for instance, South High School could ever have the resources derived from its neighborhood that Ballard or Roosevelt or even Garfield can derive from their neighborhood in Seattle is naive and foolish, I think. And Bruce and I have talked about this. Like I said, I agree philosophically that it would be wonderful if neighborhood schools were a possibility in terms of the resourcing of those schools. Nobody, though, that I know of is willing to take on the issue of how to equalize or make more equitable the resources derived from communities to students in an urban school setting. So there's that inequity that's built into that model that concerns me. The other thing is, I think, to counter what Bruce is saying, in terms of neighborhood schools, my understanding of students today, my students at Squalicum High School, my students at Ballard, and students throughout the country that I interact with, is that they are far more globally oriented now than they are in terms of their neighborhood. And which I find adults have to transit that shift in student perspective pretty soon, or we're going to lose our relationships with students, our sense of relevance with students, because students are so interactive now with a global communication system and global technology that I think if you scratch the surface of most kids in Seattle, they'll tell you their first affiliation is not to the environment of Ballard or you name your favorite neighborhood, but it's to much larger communities. So I think in a lot of ways our notion of a neighborhood school, wouldn't it be nice if my kid could walk to school and be at the school where we all live, is an artifact of an adult perception of citizenship that's not operable anymore with young kids. So I'm not so sure that's a shared value with kids. That being said, raising children in the real world, proximity is an important value, and so how to create a school system where there's a sense of safety in a neighborhood, but a sense of connection globally to accommodate kids that really are global citizens and digital natives, is perplexing and difficult question, because it does play out in terms of how our society is stratified economically, who has access to digital resources, and how we mediate education within that kind of environment is all very complicated. And some of our old structures and ways of thinking are not supporting us anymore. And so I think I'm trying to bring a new understanding to the notion of integration that, for me, means that the more diverse community you have embedded in a school, the more general and equitably you have distributed advocacy for those students. So I'll give you a good example of a friend of mine. I was talking about bemoaning the fate of air travel these days, saying, God, it feels like, cattle call now when you get on an airplane. He said, well, I know why that is. And I said, well, tell me, Michael, why is that? And he goes, well, because the people that used to fly first class are flying in private jets now, and they don't give a damn about air travel. And so there's nobody advocating for quality air service anymore, because all the old school first class flyers are gone. They're the ones that used to push for decent care on air travel. And I feel like the same thing happens in schools. If you pull out the folks with privilege and position in a community or society, then the way our political system works now, which is, from what I can tell, dollars drive politics, you're going to have schools that are abandoned that will not have the advocacy that we know is important for good schools. So For me, I'm still learning how this all works, and hopefully by the end of my career I'll be successful at it.
Well, you know, one of the phenomena that's occurred across the country is that even when you manage to achieve an integrated schools, you find a lot of segregation going on within the schools. And I was wondering, how did you manage to keep the school integrated, the student body integrated within your school, both at Ballard and Squalicum High School here in Bellingham?
That's something that we as educators have control over and can do a good job with. And I've seen schools do a fantastic job with making the most of their diversity. I think it wasn't until about 10 years ago that educators really believed that diversity offered strength to schools. I think that there was a lot of lip service to the value of it, but in terms of really taking students who are bi, trilingual and moving them in, and ethnically different, moving them into a place where that really meant something of value in terms of the academic life of a school has been a fairly recent evolution. For me, it was I looked at data, and way back when I was principal at Interlake High School, I noticed that my Latino students had no traction academically. They had the highest dropout rate. They were never on the honor rolls. They didn't enroll for advanced coursework. And so I thought, well, what can I do directly to kind of work against that? And what I did was I found out who are the leaders in this community and how can they engage kids in being successful in school. And so engaging that community and then listening to student voice, finding out what those students were experiencing in school, and then removing the roadblocks to that, either through providing extra resources like tutoring or just kind of how do you do school in America. Lots of folks don't know how you do school. It's not, you know, it doesn't get spread by ESP. You have to learn how to go about it. And to help integrate those communities into the actual lived reality of the school is something you can approach very frontally. Recruited kids into the Blue Ribbon courses, the courses that were demanding, and then demonstrating, those students would demonstrate success to their community, and from that you typically get more involvement, more pride in achievement, and more participation in programs. That formula has worked. The better I get at listening and connecting with the community, the better that works for kids. And one thing I have learned in my long experience now in education is we don't listen to our students enough, and we don't take them seriously enough, and we don't provide structures where that can be an ongoing engagement with their educational experience. And that has been an important piece of the work I've been able to do at Squalicum in terms of finding out what kids really want to see happen in their school, listening to them, and then honoring that feedback in a way that's important and reflected in our practice. This year has been especially rich for me because we've had the first student president of our site council in my history as a principal, and it has been really exciting to see a student take over the leadership of a group that really makes a lot of big decisions in our school, and to support him in that work, and for other students to watch that happen and go, I guess it does matter what we think, and I guess we can have a actual powerful role here to play in the school. We need to do more and more of that, and we need to really, as adults, give mind to what our students are saying, and do real things on a daily basis that demonstrate that commitment. You know?
Well, David, I have a lot more questions, but I have invited my colleagues to be some co-interviewers so that we can get questions from various perspectives for you. So I'd like to take this moment to introduce my co-interviewers to you. First, let me introduce Christina Anderson. And you'll be delighted to know that Christina teaches at Ballard High School. She was hired, actually, 2 years after you left. And Christina is also in our school administration program here at Western Washington University, and she is preparing to become a principal herself. Next on our panel is Brett Rubio. Brett has a law degree from Gonzaga Law School, and he's studying for a master's in political science here at Western Washington University. This spring, Brett was hired as an assistant professor at the University of Washington. And you'll probably recall that Brett was on the panel with you when we had the Educational Law and Social Justice panel about a year ago. Brett also wrote an article about the Supreme Court decision that came down in June of 2007, and our audience and readers can find that article on the Rejoinder page. Next on our panel is Molly Lawrence. Molly is a new faculty member in the Secondary Education Department at the Woodring College of Education, and is also our newest member of our editorial board. And finally, we have Johan Neem. Johan is a faculty member in the History Department at Western Washington University, where he specializes in the history of the United States, or in American history. Thank you very much for joining me, all of you. And maybe we could begin with Christina. Christina, since you now currently work at Ballard High School, maybe you could share with us what's happening today after the Supreme Court decision came down.
Okay. Ballard High School has approximately 1,600 students, about 85 certificated teachers. Of those 1,600 students right now, our student population is about 62% white. I think approximately 13% African American, and then the percentages break down from there. Asian, Pacific Islander, Latino students. We also have about 100 English language learning students that are in a specific ELL program type setting. Another significant change at Ballard, 2 years ago we began a pilot program for the Seattle School District around transportation, mainly through cost-saving efforts. Seattle wanted to experiment with eliminating the yellow bus system in our secondary schools. They chose Ballard High School in the north and Franklin High School in the south to be the two pilot secondary schools for this project, mainly because we have the most bus lines that cross our main streets. So students have been given Metro bus cards, monthly Metro bus cards, that are good whenever they want, but we have no yellow bus service serving our school currently, except for some specific special education students. And what this has done, because students currently are under the open enrollment plan, we did see a shift a little bit in our enrollment from students in the south end of Seattle who had been attending Ballard High School simply because they didn't want to get up so early to to make 4 transfers in the early morning darkness to make it to our school. It especially hurt our ELL population dramatically. Actually, it was pretty traumatizing for that program initially, and we worked with the district and some of our parents to try and sort that out a little bit. But we did lose quite a few kids to South End schools for that reason, transportation and distance. So as it stands now, we are, like I said, at about 1,600 students. We are one of the least racially diverse schools in the district, just in terms of the numbers. Yeah.
Christina, do you have any questions you would like to ask?
I do. So, Dr. Engle, I want to ask you a little bit about your definition of terms around the term diverse student populations and the value of diverse student populations. And I want to give you a little background about why I want to ask you this question. I've been thinking a lot about this in the term diversity and what does it really mean. And I think it's a very broad term, but one that oftentimes specific people have a specific idea of how they want to define it, and I think it's important to consider the student's definition. You were talking about including student voice and how important that is, and I'm coming to the conclusion that diversity to our students means something different than it does to educators and academics. And we just celebrated Diversity Day at Ballard, and it was completely student planned. And the workshops and ideas and themes that our students wanted to discuss had very little to do with race. They celebrated differences, differences of interests, differences of opinion, differences of background, but not necessarily a cultural one even. And it was a conversation that then our staff had about what does diversity mean. And so I feel like it's interesting to be here now and talk a little bit more about this. And I'm curious to know, what is your opinion of a diverse student population, and what does that look like to you? And does it matter that perhaps it means something different to our students?
Yeah, this is an interesting question for us to look at. Let me frame this discussion in a way that kind of helps pull in different perspectives. For me, you use the term difference as being kind of the boundaries around what diversity is for students. I think in a society where people are uncomfortable to talk about race and how it plays, and to talk about privilege and how it plays, and to engage around those issues is not easy for students who haven't had kind of structured ways to think about those issues. So it's easier to fall back on those things that are kind of more immediate and tenable in student lives. And by that I mean students understand differences kind of from a more proximate level. So they know how other kids are different from them. They may, their experience teaches them what diversity is, and they reflect that. For me, from a professional and kind of institutional perspective and a social perspective, my view of diversity includes the kind of student notions about diversity, but has to be broader because of the issues I think I've raised earlier in the conversation about who's going to advocate for groups that have traditionally been not included at the table of equity. So for me, as an adult school official, I have to look at kind of broader cuts in terms of diversity. What is at play here, and how do I influence those forces at play? That's not to in any way diminish the student notion of diversity at that very granular level where maybe a student's talking about gender issues, orientations, socioeconomic issues, or maybe even about differences in terms of who they like in music. I mean, the granularity can be pretty, for students, pretty immediate and important, but in terms of my impact as a school administrator, I can't really can change that world much of their proximate sense of difference. Where I have to kind of hold the line for my notion of diversity is around the notion of, if we believe No Child Left Behind is important legislation and that all kids in the eyes of the law are equal, or at least deserving of an equal opportunity, then we have to look at the forces that shape educational resources and experiences for every student. So for me, I look at the things that limit schools' ability to respond to the individual needs of kids. Historically, they have been built around economics, around race, around culture and ethnicity, those things. And you know, I don't have to draw you into a discussion of the history of Native Americans or African Americans or women or ethnic minorities or immigrants or those communities to know that for them to interact in our public education system and have access to educational experiences and resources in a way that allows them to be mobile in our society have been brokered around those differences. So those are kind of the big kind of differences we attribute publicly to diversity. Again, back to a student's perception on diversity, that's going to be more granular and more kind of low to the ground, I think, more idiosyncratic. And and just as interesting, but in terms of how I can influence their sense of diversity, I can bring them into the conversation about the larger forces that play in the life of school systems. And so from my perspective, I typically will take a more systems approach where students will take more of an idiosyncratic kind of generational perspective. And those two come together, intersect in lots of interesting ways, and sometimes not in ways we adults understand or appreciate. That being said, again, I come back to looking at the larger forces involved here, and I know that that's where I can play a part in being a positive influence. So that students who are native to a diverse student body population will tell me we like who we are as a student body versus how do we get in there, or how are we included as part of that, because for them they don't always have the periscope that lets them see how life could be different if they had different opportunities and resources available. So I think it's the adult role to put the periscope up and say, here's where we could be more effective in meeting your needs, and here's what we can offer in terms of a different landscape. So I hope that kind of responds to the question about diversity. And I do know that because, like most terms in the public conversation about things that are difficult, that term over time has degraded to mean almost anything. You know, it can mean almost fashion differences. And certainly that's not where I live. I live with around what I call the gold-plated American issues of race, class, and gender. And you know, when those issues get in the way of our kids, every kid being helped ahead, then I think we have a responsibility to pay attention to those big demarcations.
I really appreciate your question, Christina, and your response, David. I have found that something has been happening around this whole question of diversity. It has become such a broad and wide concept that people are saying, well, why don't we just treat everyone as an individual? And what gets lost in the dialogue then are the discussions about historical injustices and the need to meet those injustices, and how, as you pointed out, how those injustices continue to shape our resources, continue to limit opportunities. I think it's something we still need to talk a lot about, and I'm glad you brought up that concept. What do we mean by diversity? Talking about diversity from the perspective of Ballard, why don't we turn to our look at the broad context of American history? And Johan Neem, you're an expert in the area of American history. Do you have any thoughts that you'd like to raise at this point?
Thank you, Lorraine, and it's an honor to be here with you. I guess what I'm interested in is picking up on Christina's question of diversity, is thinking about how attitudes towards diversity have changed, particularly among minority populations. And in some ways, to think about this, in 1954, when Brown versus Board was handed down, the African American leadership was fairly confident that integration was necessary and vital to achieving equality, a position that you earlier stated you still support. And ultimately, the Supreme Court agreed that separation is inherently unequal. But over the course of the 60s and 70s, many minority groups embraced under a wide banner the concept of multiculturalism and suggested that integration may not be always the best way to treat other groups with respect, particularly because it tends to flatten out diversity, or in some cases give those with power greater privilege over those without power. And so today, my understanding is that there are some leaders among minority groups who have said that when it comes to schooling, integration doesn't necessarily need to be the best strategy, but building on what Lorraine's earlier question about Bruce Bivens' article, that in some cases maybe what we want is to maintain some sort of cultural separation. And added to that is the historical experience that Christina mentioned, busing often being a burden to those very groups that are supposed to be the beneficiaries of integration. So I wonder, given your experience, how would you, it's one thing to respond to privileged upper middle class or upper class white parents about the importance of integration. How would, or in fact, how did you respond to minority leaders who questioned the value of integration today?
What I have begun to hear more of, and I go back far enough now to remember Malcolm X and to actually have my own memories of the early '60s and the struggle, and those voices for separatism were loud and clear, and have always been kind of part of the American discussion about how to resolve the issues of race in America, and our history is again demonstrated to us that this conversation is ongoing. The modern notions of separatism are that integration will disempower us as people and as a group, and will erase, diminish what we value in terms of cultural identity. Here's my problem with that. First of all, I look around the world and I go, where is this working? I don't know of a place where kind of this official separatism works. It irretrievably ends up in a process of conflict and violence everywhere I look. So would I be hopeful for that? I'm always hopeful for the best, but if I pay attention to history, I would know that good luck, that's not going to happen. A good example of why I think we're in the midst of a struggle, and we need to remember that. There's not like an end point to this. Being human means you struggle, and means that you always push boundaries for justice as far as you can in your lifetime. And I think for me, I look at the history of gender equality. When I was in high school, my younger sisters could not, there were no sports for them to turn out for. And so anybody that says you can't change kind of a difficult social parameters is not paying attention to their own lifespan. That has changed. And it's changed because there was a feminist movement that was sharp-edged, persistent, and vocal, and it pushed the boundaries. And now it's a given, an assumption on the part of my young women at my school that they will have access to educational resources around athletics equal to the boys. No argument. So I think you need to pay attention to why is race so sticky. And I would argue that it's as plastic and pliant to change as the gender issue has been, but it requires more energy and focus. And part of how privilege works in our society is we pretend to be colorblind. And so we have these long periods where we don't talk about race. Well, guess what? It's back big time with Obama's candidacy, which I'm really happy to see that development, because I think this is, at some point in this election cycle, we're going to have some pretty strong conversations about race, because it's going to bubble up and surface and be out in the open. Another good example I can give you, I've worked for a while now as an advisor with the Marine Corps and the U.S. military to look at some training programs they have for their inductees or volunteers now. And the military is clearly on a path of integration. They know you cannot have effective military fighting units that are not thoroughly integrated, that where it's clear, the communication's clear, where the differences between members of a team do not get in the way of effectiveness. They know that's a life and death reality. And so given the fact that their mission is to be an effective fighting force, nothing else kind of trumps that. And if it does, it's costly. Granted, the military now is demarcated by socioeconomics, and that's unfortunate, but the commitment early on to integrating the military ought to serve as a tale of hope to the American public that integration is actually a viable notion, that it can be powerful in our society. And the notion that we can kind of separate and somehow not be troubled by this struggle, I think is folly. And I think I'm not moving in that direction in any way, shape, or form, because I believe that Martin Luther King knew what was at stake. When he talked about integration, he didn't talk about it in terms of what's commonly understood by some folks in the multicultural movement. He understood it as important for the spiritual survival of this nation, that this nation's founded on an experiment that says all men and women are created equal, and that plays out legally, plays out economically, and plays out in terms of our politics. And it was when he started touching the economics, I think, that and pushing the politics in terms of the anti-war movement that he became especially dangerous. But those were the stakes around integration that were drawn early on in this struggle, and I think we have to come back to that commitment. So I think that I would rather kind of struggle with the issues around the concerns folks have in the minority community about loss of identity and cultural presence. Those are issues I'd rather struggle around than giving up on integration as the way forward, because I think looking at human history, the prognosis is not good if we base our lives on kind of separate realities.
Brett, would you like to
Yes,
ask a question?
in fact, I do have a question. And, well, David, in your article, you do mention that your move to Ballard High School was akin to basically fulfilling a dream come true, and you mentioned because there's a brand new state-of-the-art facility. But along with the brand new facility, you also mentioned that you were glad you took leadership of a very dynamic and forward-thinking staff. And now I'm thinking, my question is that whether or not, in your opinion, the school choice program, along with the tiebreaker, with the race tiebreaker, whether or not that's an idea, a policy, a concept that is either ahead of its time, right on time, or far overdue. Please.
First of all, I don't think the notion of, I call it all through my conversation with folks, the racial tiebreaker was a tool to achieve an end around integration and school integration. So I never saw it as an end point, and from my perspective, it was a tool that was useful at the time. I think it was long overdue. I think had it been tried sooner, it might have been more effectively integrated into kind of the social context of schooling. Busing was a singular failure in Seattle and not effective. So I think it was probably long overdue. That being said, it wasn't enough on its own to kind of create the schools at least I dream of. It's a tool, and I felt districts ought to have a variety of tools at hand. I think the Supreme Court decision limiting the use of that tool creates some powerful problems for urban educators now, because there are fewer tools and a more constrained environment to address the issues that are right in the faces of urban educators, that race does matter, poverty does matter, those things live within your school every day, and you have fewer tools to kind of address those issues. So for me, it was never an end-all. It was a tool that was helpful in the struggle, and now that it's gone, you have one less tool and questions about what can we do to address the issues.
Molly, you're preparing students to become high school teachers, middle school teachers, for schools like Ballard and Squalicum. What concerns do you have that you'd like to raise?
I'd like to revisit the idea that's kind of been underlying a lot of what we've been talking about, this notion of change and how we bring about change, because that's at the fore of pre-service teachers' thinking when they step out into the field. And so I would love it if you could take a minute to reflect back on the decision you made to resign and share with us to what degree you feel like change was affected, and at what, there are various levels of change, of course, that can be affected. So to what degree was change affected, and in what ways was it unable to be affected in light of the decision that you made?
It's a good question, one that I I revisit frequently. Late in life, I've learned to be more patient. I think at the time I was driven by a deep sense of impatience about this, almost like, why are we still struggling with this issue? You know, after a lifetime, and again, that comes out of my sense of privilege, that after I've been here long enough, the world should have changed for me. Well, that's, you know, a fundamental silliness to that. So in terms of patience, I know that change in our society is generational, which is difficult to understand for anybody that wants, you know, quick results, especially in our society where communication's instant but change is generational. And the kind of significant social change is still, I think, operating in a generational time frame. That being said, I think you can expect in a generation to see significant changes, provided people are equipped with the kind of moral fortitude, technical skills, and sense of history to navigate the challenges posed by change initiatives. So when I look at new teachers, I look at a whole different skill set than I would have looked at 20 years ago when I started in school administration. I look for flexibility. I look for people that have a strong sense of values that they can articulate clearly. I look for people that have demonstrated adaptability, that have demonstrated that they're paying attention to patterns and the larger changes in the world around us, that are historically informed and willing to engage in a profession that's about struggle and about learning and about change more than it's about arrival, received knowledge, and kind of the dissemination of their wisdom. But it's about constructed knowledge and about honoring students as, in some ways, equal learners. And so it requires a very different profile of people than when I came into education, very different. And I think some of those changes have happened in our generation demonstrably in terms of just look at the evolution of the internet and the part it's played in every aspect of our society and how it's changed everything except education in significant ways. And yet the kids that we have in our schools today are full participants in that new world. And in some ways they feel trapped in an old structure. And our job as educators is to change the structure or let it collapse and rebuild out of the ashes a system that really does help young people have wisdom about how to live in a society that's been shaped by the history we've shared. And it takes a very different teacher than it used to. And I know that schools of education around the country are struggling with how do we get people there? How do we ourselves change the structure of how we generate the next generation of educators so that we're aligned with who the learners are. I think that disjunction right now is really exceptionally challenging and painful for lots of people. I would say that in my school right now that nearly 50% of my staff feel like they're caught in a crossfire right now between wanting to change the structure of how we interact with our students, how learning occurs, and the old models of how it occurs. At least half of my teachers feel discomfort around that. The newer teachers feel less discomfort, but they're fully engaged in the struggle because they have to lead the way when they had hoped to be led. And so that kind of leadership dimension for new teachers, I think, is a shock to their systems because there's kind of this thing when you enter a profession, you want to learn from your masters, and that's in a different environment now. People are looking to you to be a leader when you come into the system because of that change in our environment. And so it's difficult. Neither of my children have chosen education as their profession, and I've extolled the virtues of it their whole lives. And clearly they're watching and deciding based on what they see whether or not that's a path to pursue. So I think we really have a lot of work to do around the preparation of the next generation of teachers. That's just as daunting as what we face now in the schools.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So when you think about that perspective of a beginning teacher coming in with all this idealism and this whole sense of being able to bring about change, and then think about the lessons that you learned from the experience you had at Ballard High School, obviously your decision was partially to bring about change. You talked about being interested in engaging in dialogue with the community, which you felt like your decision was one way in which that could happen. So what would you tell pre-service teachers, people who are very interested in change, that you've learned about bringing about change based on your experiences?
Yeah, I think teachers have to develop, and this will be new for teachers, to develop what I call an entrepreneurial social agenda. And that means they have to come into schools and start creating networks for change at a real ground level. They have to find out who else on this staff is interested in significant, deep change. What can I do today to connect with those people? What can we do tomorrow to change the life for our students and ourselves? And how do we build a vision that's different than what applies now in a way that's safe and constructive? Oftentimes, the idealistic teachers will come into a school and alienate themselves almost immediately by declaring to the veteran staff that you're wrong, you're wrong-headed, you're on the wrong track, you're going to fail. And then they become isolated almost immediately. The savvy young new teachers, and I'll stay away from young, but new teachers are the ones that take a look at the landscape, look at who they can network with, look for leadership that's entrepreneurial, that will support them, and then start building those alliances and making those changes at the kind of day-to-day level and work steadily for that. One thing, as I've said before, privilege tends to expect immediate results because that's how the world's been built around privilege. If you're in a struggle, though, you have to create alliances and networks, and you have to have the kind of idealism that can withstand lots of setbacks and be yeah, kind of weathering is how I put it. So well-weathered new teachers are important, and I did a lot more in the past 5 years with my new teachers than I've ever done before in terms of what I call sheltering them, where we meet together periodically on a regular basis to talk about where are you guys at now, how's your fire burning, what do you need to know in terms of just pragmatic, how does this thing operate, information, what can I do to support you, and then keep pushing their thinking about what does a new system look like to you, and how do we work on it within the old structure, and to create the kind of leadership around that they need to have supported. I've spent a lot of time lately looking at how teacher leadership can help us change how schools are organized, because I think administrative leadership is not enough, and it's not sufficient, and nobody's charismatic enough to pull it off. And so it has to be a really broad kind of alliance between all professionals in schools. And again, students have to be deeply embedded in that work, and they have to be incorporated in ways that are frightening to a lot of adults. They have to have power in that system. And if they don't, you're play acting. So that's kind of my formula, and I hope that those people preparing teachers can present the richness of that to them without diminishing, what you need to do to prepare teachers.
Well, our time has gone very rapidly. And David, I know that you're leaving our town of Bellingham to take on a new position in Nebraska. What is your new position now?
Well, I've recently was named the superintendent of schools of the North Platte School District in Nebraska. It's a long story how I ended up in the Midwest, but I'm excited about the opportunity to go to a district that I think is right-sized. I can get my arms around the 14 schools there and make changes that I think will impact every student in the system versus a large urban district where my energies would be dissipated more quickly And so I'm looking forward to the chance to work with the whole system and see if my ideas test out in the real acting out of what needs to happen for kids.
Well, we'd like to thank you so much and wish you luck in your new position. And I'd like to thank our panel as well.
Yes, thank you.